it changed a lot of things for me for a start now, probably because people really, really dug it and it got amazing press and so on. I've done actually my first ever album at the same time as this book, Revenge of the She-Punks. So you're definitely when Staubgold in France put out that retrospective compilation, you know, it really shifted things for me. More than I'd even anticipated. For a start, it led to this book, Revenge of the She-Punks, because they heard of me at the University of Texas, because Pitchfork did an article, 33 revolutionary women punk songs or some such.
Pitchfork was, throughout the entire process of that album coming out, Pitchfork was very kind to you.
They were very supportive, yeah. And so they put my song Private Armies, which was a sort of political song that really, really is relevant today, to a depressing extent, one could say. And they got me to write a little thing. And it was about 200 words, 250 words. I remember thinking, well, what can I possibly do? You know, what am I going to say? And then I thought I'd like to do something that would sort of energize and rally the troops.
What were the parameters of the piece specifically?
Oh, well, it was just because they were putting the song in the list.
Yeah. And they told you to write anything within a relatively small... Exactly. So that's what happened. And then it filtered through to the University of Texas Press, and this woman there, Gianna Lamorte, she saw it, and apparently she cut it out or something, or printed it out and put it on her desk, and apparently people kept saying, oh, that's interesting. And then she called me and said, would I be interested in exploring further these ideas about the connection between women and punk? I hadn't actually been thinking of doing that, you know, but then when she suggested it to me, I was like, oh, I probably really, really should, because I have a lot of thoughts, you know, and I've lived through quite a lot. I've seen this whole cycle after cycle unfold, and, you know, I felt like I felt about my Exodus book, that I was lucky enough to have lived through certain things, and I should make sure that people knew that information if I could, if at all possible. So, and then they said, well, what angle did I want to take? So I went away and thought about it, and I realized, you know, a lot of people, they're very quick to rush to judgment. Oh, punk is dead, punk is castrated, punk is a spent force. But I knew that punk's most important aspect was as a liberating force for female artists. Because even if you look at the great punk icons, you know, say the Clash and the Sex Pistols, total respect. What were they doing? They were continuing a lineage. Whereas what the women were doing, it is actually safe to say, was utterly unprecedented. Yeah. And that's very unusual to say that anything on the planet is utterly unprecedented. But that wave of revolutionist female artists, they'd never seen their like before. The world had never seen their like before. And then they were silenced, and then the Riot Girls picked up the torch, and then a lot later, you know, an acknowledgement and, you know, real synergy started to happen. I mean, I put in the book how at a certain point, when the internet was young, we didn't have Facebook and all that, I was contacted by the European collective Chicks on Speed, who are very, very active and sort of brilliant. I hadn't heard of them before, but they'd somehow heard of me. It was way before the record was reissued, and they were eager to make this connection, and they put out a compilation CD called Girl Monster, and that gathered a lot of scattered women's music, and it was the first time I saw a concerted effort to construct a her story. Then there was another CD, Sharon Signs to Cherry Red. Disclosure, I'm on both of them, but, you know, that's just the way it is. These were significant releases because it made me think again, I who'd lived through it, you know. And I describe in the book, like, I was already a rock writer when I went to some show, and there was a long-haired person in jeans playing the guitar, slashing out power chords and what have you. And I go to the front of the stage and I'm like, oh my goddess, it's a woman! And I was really shocked. You know, I had never seen a woman play before. And I was already grown. I was already in my 20s. Yeah.
So you see how there really hasn't been a lot of it about, and it's really the old Shakespeare's sister syndrome, isn't it? And look at the art world, it's the same thing. Now women artists are just starting to get their due, just like we're having a women's football team start now with So really, women have been it's just a fact. You only have to look at it. We have been stomped on since the days of the goddess.
This is fresh in my mind because I recently spoke to a woman named Denise Kaufman. Do you know her? She's in a band called Ace of Cups in San Francisco in the 60s.
Oh.
On all-female rock bands.
No,
they actually...
They are. I hadn't even heard of them.
Yeah. Well,
typical of what I mean, that's sort of silenced and hidden.
Yeah, well, they had the problem from the standpoint of, they were in San Francisco, so they were playing with the Dead, and they opened for Hendrix and all these people. But they weren't able to get signed, and they had families, had kids, went on with their lives. And I think one of the big difference here is that there was a critical mass. Like, there have been dribs and drabs, perhaps, of women playing music, but mid to late 70s, early 80s, like, there was finally enough of them to start a movement.
That's part of it, and part of it shifting the zeitgeist. Like, I do talk in the book about how, like, I have an interesting dialogue with Leslie Woods from the Au Pairs, who's a fantastic band, and they were political. And yet also very, very catchy. So she's an immigration lawyer now. And it's so interesting. I'm actually haunted by this conversation, this interview. And I would like to go back and discuss it with her again. Because, it takes a while to get a book out and it takes a while to write a book. So although this book is new, I actually spoke to her, say, over 2 years ago. So at that time, she says to me, at the time they were doing this danceable pop relating to gender issues in many cases and gender equality. She said, we were just coming out of that time and just getting legislation whereby if a woman was beaten up by her husband, she had legal recourse. And that was like 2 years old. So everything was shifting. I have to be honest, like my big sister Judy, hello Judy, she's always going on me, it's all right for you, but when I was your age as a teenager or in my early 20s, I wouldn't have been allowed to buy a house had I been able to. You had to get signed for by a husband or your father. So you see, if you look at it in the broader social context, you see why things are changing. Funny we should be talking about all this because I am just reading the autobiography of Goldie and the Gingerbreads, and I mention her in the book. At that moment I hadn't really known that she had her own autobiography. I so wish I'd read it then, because I would have liked to quote it. She just says straight up, it was so hard to get the women musicians for Goldie and the Gingerbreads, and she puts it in the context where it just totally wasn't a done thing, for women to do bands. I also note in the book that one of the things I learned while doing it over 2 years, one of the engines is literally sisters. I mean, I have to say that for me, it was artists who were like sisters, like the Slits and then Cherry and the Raincoats, so sisterin, as we say from the Jamaican influence. But really, when you think about it, and a high proportion of the bands in this book are actually sisters. Remember Hart, the Millington? The Millingtons. The Wilsons. Yeah. Then there's Fanny, the Millingtons. And I think there were so many challenges to being a woman doing music. I mean, whether you were an all-woman band or you were the one of one or two women in a band, that really to have a sister... you have a primal relationship that's going to endure whether you're playing together or not.
Built-in support that you have there.
Voila. Shonen Knife for sisters, and the group from Colombia, Fertil Miseria, who on whose note I conclude the book. I have to say they did amaze me. They amazed me so much. And it took a really long time to get to speak to them properly. It was a very, very long exchange over months. Partly, obviously, because I don't speak Spanish, despite my 7 years of Latin. And a couple of friends of mine, Eve Blouin, who I used to have the band Chantage with, and my friend Xenia Cassidy, who's a Russian journalist who worked with Pussy Riot.
Eve was actually on the show last time. She was...
Oh, Eve, yes!
She was in the apartment. Yeah, it was just a fun coincidence. Where she was like, I'll sit over here, and then she slowly started ingratiating herself into the conversation.
Yes, Eve has moved away from the music, because otherwise she'd be singing singing with me now, but she's just not that interested. She's in another phase. I suppose ultimately maybe I was the more musically driven of the duo. One can only conclude. But yeah, we're still super tight. In fact, she's coming to hang out and stay here in a couple of days. So, yeah, for a few days. Colombia. Yeah, so Ev and Xenia, the Russian journalist, helped me communicate with Fertile Miseria. But that's what doing this book was like. It wasn't just like, let's call the PR. No, I went out and really, researched globally women artists and, listened to a lot of music, because obviously I had to like the music. There is a playlist on Spotify of the whole book.
Each of the chapters
has a playlist. But I suppose because of this thing where I was annoyed at people seeing punk in a very territorial way, like, oh, if you weren't at CBGB's for 2 minutes, or if you weren't at Ladbroke Grove under the Westway, my place, for 2 minutes, then, and to me it always seemed, in addition, a way to diminish female creativity, because knowing that punk had opened the door for women in a totally different way than Goldie and the Gingerbreads had experienced, all your friends in San Francisco. So I was like, yeah, lock us down again, will you? No, I want to show what my gut told me, which is that punk was still freeing female artists around the world, because I just sensed it, I knew it, and that's what the book proves it. When I found the people I was curious about, and I tracked them down, and I managed to speak to them. As I said, in the case of Fertile Miseria, it took months. It vindicated everything that my intuition had told me. My feminine? No, but yeah, really, everything I thought was in fact correct. Anyway, Fertile Miseria, because I was always more interested in punk for its political usefulness. Musically, there was interesting things in New York, obviously. But the more political edge was from my cultural formation, with Rock Against Racism versus the National Front. All that conflict that is scarily relevant again now, as you know.
It wasn't really until I think hardcore came around that it became an overtly political movement in the
America.
United States.
Yeah, it's certainly in New York. It was more. I sometimes think art. It was more. More arty. I think it was more. Maybe I sometimes think, although I've had some Americans agree and some disagree with me, that in a way, even though there's a lot of denial about that it was in a way a reaction against having so narrowly escaped being drafted for Vietnam. Because if you look at it, Vietnam ends at the time of Glam as the punk thing is just about to start. So all those boys and all those bands, their elder brothers would have either gone to war or managed to get out of it, and they would have been next in line. There are not that many Vietnam vets in punk bands that I know of.
Not that I'm aware of.
Right.
No. Yeah.
So you see what I mean? It's literally the next generation that just squeaked past and managed not to get, come home in a bag like Country Joe and the Fish used to say.
You can point to Ramones songs, I think, where Vietnam was addressed. That was a little bit of a piece of it.
That's true.
There was some residual there.
That's true, actually. I always think of them as performance artists.
I get the feeling it was either Johnny or Dee Dee who did have a political...
Well, some of them are Holocaust background like me, because I'm a child of Holocaust refugee people. And some of them were like that, and some of them collected Nazi memorabilia, which is this weird duality that even I, sort of grapple with. Is it to get a sense of control over those who try to decimate you? Or is it just some weird fetishistic SM kick? I just don't know.
A number of years ago, I was in Cologne, Germany, and I ran into Francois Moulet and Art Spiegelman. And Art was they were doing a retrospective of his work. Obviously, his best known work is Mouse, so he deals heavily in the political. They did a slideshow, and after the Mohammed cartoons had come out, Ahmadinejad did a contest to do Holocaust denial cartoons, which Art Spiegelman entered in because he's very tongue-in-cheek. And I watched a crowd of Germans, probably, Gen X, maybe older millennials, laugh at these cartoons, and it was a very surreal experience, the relationship that they have with that horrible thing. I think the media generation, their equivalent of the boomers, carried all that guilt, and they're kind of grappling with how they deal with it, to be in a city like Cologne or Berlin where there's reminders of it everywhere.
Yeah.
It's a very complex relationship.
Very complex, because, you can take the person out of Germany and kick them out, but they're still German. There's a bit of me that still feels German, even though I've barely been there. But I was invited to go and perform there last September at the Berlin Popkulturfest. I was staying in a hotel right where my grandmother had a little kosher restaurant on the Alexanderplatz, but it was also bombed. You would never know, And, I have to say, it was fantastic to be invited back, and I still resonate a lot with Germany.
I'm Jewish myself, and so much of America's knowledge is tied to World War II, when we discussed Germany, and that was 70 years ago at this point. It did take me kind of a little while to adjust and to try to navigate what that relationship was when you're walking down the streets of Berlin, and they've got the little plaques in front of all of the buildings of all of the people who were pulled out and sent to camps. Anyway, sorry, we got...
No, this is interesting. It's real. We shouldn't deny it, the dialogue, it's real.
But you feel that there's bands like the Ramones, that there's a piece of that left something residual from World War II.
Yeah, but I wish I'd understood it more when I was hanging out with them in their loft. I found them, it's like, we didn't have big, deep talks. But maybe that was my fault. So I only understood all this later. They're very intriguing, speaking as a punk professor. They had this thing about doing white music. You know about that?
How do you
that was their aesthetic.
White music?
They were trying to make a thing. But they were Jewish. They can't really have been massive right-wingers, but that was their thing. They were trying to make a music that was not grounded in the blues, like so much music is grounded in the blues, isn't it?
Yeah.
To R&B.
Absolutely.
And on.
Yeah.
And the blues, especially in America, but even in other places, it's like become a foundation stone for popular music. And they were trying to do something not rooted in the blues that was, quote, white, quote.
It's interesting to hear that, because you've got the feeling that so much of what they did, or I get the feeling that so much of what they did was just sort of, visceral. And there's almost this idea in hindsight that they were a bunch of, dumb guys from Queens making this music, but it sounds like, your interaction with them is that it was more, I don't want to say calculated, but maybe more thoughtful.
Performance art.
Yeah. But that they were very aware of what they were doing.
You see, I don't know this from interviewing them, and like I said, I remember hanging out with them, but it was sort of superficial. Again, I'm sure it's, I should have engaged them more deeply. We probably, I don't know, it was probably. They were very kind to me, and very generous, and invited me round and stuff, but I didn't really get to know them. All this is what I've pieced together later. I enjoyed them, but I suppose a lot of my thinking at that time was very reggae and jazz oriented, and I maybe didn't appreciate them the way I did later, artistically, as I grew more to appreciate them. But I do see them as an art piece.
In order for some of these bands to have been political, they were sort of, grasping at something or addressing something a little bit larger and more abstract in the world, or something that was a few decades removed, versus women in punk were dealing with very immediate issues that impacted their lives and their bodies.
Yeah, well, I think it's simply the fact that they were doing anything was revolutionary.
Yeah.
Whatever political stance they had to it. One last word on the Ramones, as we're talking about them now, I'm thinking they were sort of like Gilbert and George. Very, very legendary performance artists who are now iconic. They're from Europe. Well studied performance pieces. To me, they evolved a shtick.
Isn't Pussy Riot like that in a sense? They're certainly performative. They have aesthetic.
I think they're less contrived. Yeah, they perform, but I think they're less contrived and artful. Whereas the Ramones made themselves seem as if they were brothers. They all took... Pussy Riot are all trying to be anonymous, in fact. But musically, they're just more straightforward punk, I think. Political punk. Whereas I think the Ramones, they just seem something more like a shtick about them. Whereas Pussy Riot, they definitely are art. They were part of many art groups and many art collectives, so they are artistic. So maybe there's more to the connection than I'd realised.
Yeah. Obviously they're not anonymous, or at least certain members of them are not anonymous in the way they were. I was under the impression that they were anonymous because they kind of had to be, right? In order to be that sort of overtly political.
To be politically effective.
And where they were to not, be constantly thrown in prison, that was a big part of it.
Yeah, because they were, unlike the Ramones, they were doing things that were against the law.
Yeah, I'm curious if you've considered the role that anonymity plays in their identity.
Well, I think it was a good idea under the circumstances.
Well, sure. I mean, in terms of their own personal safety, but how that impacts them as artists and our perception and their music of not having their faces out there. Obviously, like rock and roll.
The consumption of their music, anyway. They do the best they can possibly do. I don't think it's affected necessarily by the anonymity. I think that they play as, they give it their all. I don't know whether that's impacted by the anonymity. I don't know whether the creative process of actually trying to write a song, maybe, if anything, they feel more free to say things, possibly. I would imagine so.
Yeah. Although, even if you have your head covered at a certain point, that anonymity does go away.
Well, that's over now anyway. I interviewed one of them in the book, the woman who's sort of the musical director, and she's in another band too called WOTT, WOTT. When I interviewed them for the New York Times, I interviewed one of them when, all this confrontation was starting to go down. I managed to get hold of one, but I still don't know her real name. She asked to be called Bullet. She was the one who was responsible for pulling the clothes together. And the woman I interview in the band, in the book, is the one somewhat-ish, given that it's more collective. She's a bit more the musical director in that, she's the most into that aspect. Arrangement and so on.
I suspect that a big part of the difficulty in pulling this book together initially was kind of figuring out where the parameters lie, who you were going to talk to.
It was an exploration. So yeah, it's really true, Brian. I really thought, where would people doing punky music, and again, it doesn't always only have to be loud and fast. That spirit is the most important thing. So I literally did look a little bit I was curious about the Indian subcontinent. So I wonder how it's playing out there. I didn't really know, and then I asked some people, like even DJ Rekha lives around the corner, the godmother of Bhangra in America.
Yeah, we're in a pretty heavily Indian area right now.
And she lives around the corner, but I suppose it's not her musical area, but she didn't know of anyone. I just carried on, researching.
Yeah.
And I came across this case that really affected me, of the group Pra-Agash, meaning light. They were a trio of schoolgirls who made a band, and they played like rock guitar over tablas, and the little that I heard sounded really good, but they had been so silenced. There was a fatwa put on them, and although they did have people spring to their defense, in the region, in the end, the death threats were just too much. It was in Kashmir, which is the only heavily Muslim area of India. And that was it. They were really silenced. And I found this bit of footage from a TV interview. Just the look in the young woman's eyes and the slump of her shoulder as she turned away from the camera. The journalist was pressing her, and she was more and more uncomfortable. And in the end, she just sort of muttered, the fatwa, and she turned away. It was just dagger in my heart time, so you just the young woman couldn't express herself at all. She was putting her whole family at risk. She said, I'm going to go back and just focus on my engineering studies. And then I found this other band who are a very active punk band in India, but not in Kashmir. They're called the Vinyl Records. And they're totally like one in the eye for this cultural appropriation debate, in that they're not at all shy to totally culturally appropriate pop-punk music. That's a lengthy debate, They had heard of Pragash, and they were aware they were comparatively privileged in a more liberal area. But I wanted to show in the book women punky, slightly rebellious artists. They really are a threat. That's why the system was always so keen to keep them quiet and just cut off the knowledge so that there was no legacy built. But I think, that's what I'm saying about, hopefully this book will be a contribution to that. Any, as they say, young, but it could be older. Any woman who feels that she's having to make absolutely everything up as she goes along. Yes, you are slightly reinventing the wheel. There is a wheel somewhere. if you keep looking, yes, there is a wheel, and that wheel will help keep you rolling. So that was, to me, the job of the book.
Was there a sense that in order to find contemporary music that's kind of vibrant and political in the same way, that you would have to seek it out in places like India, that the repercussions would be there now?
I mean, I'm being honest, I was like a million times I've done stories of you've done stories. You have an idea and you have to go out and prove it or not. I had this gut feeling, like I said, that there was a number of women around the world building on this punk tradition, and that there was really a movement, and it wasn't all dead and gone, so pat, the way so many people like to put it.
People have been saying punk is dead since the beginning of punk.
Well, that's because, that's true, but that's because also, you can't deny that punk has been commodified.
Yeah.
You can't deny it. I participated, and I myself took money, to be honest, but I am a freelancer, and if you want to send me some money, I quite likely take it. But from the British government, when they decided to honour punk, was it 2 years ago, and I went and spoke at South by Southwest and so on, there's no doubt it was a massive irony, because, of course, punk was all about not respecting the government and trying to change things, and the government was all about suppressing punk, and yet, here we all were praising it. But at the same time, to me, the point about the punk was the energizing and liberating spirit of it, and the way it was a gateway to doing music for people who didn't have any role models. Like, you remember, even I was saying to you, and I came from a musical family. My father had been a musician, and we were all musical, but I'd never seen a woman play on stage before. I mean, I loved Dusty Springfield. I loved Sandy Shaw. I loved Cilla Black. And then, of course, who doesn't love Aretha, say, or Mavis Staples, who I got to interview. Remember, who did I Can't Stand the Rain?
Oh.
Ann Peebles.
Yeah.
Love Ann Peebles. So you see what I mean? But you see how that wasn't a sort of band of women. That was, a woman, not always even necessarily doing exactly what she wanted.
Likely she didn't write the music in a lot of the cases. She was part of a studio system.
And you had to please a cultural gatekeeper with often a reductive view. One person who did find her way through that system was Dusty Springfield. I mean, she was just so fantastic that people cut her some slack. But still, there'd never been anything like seeing all these women come together. I mean,
she kept her sexuality under wraps. There were a lot of things that she still couldn't do. I mean, obviously she was fantastic, but
there were still compromises. Filters. So definitely, there's just no question. Except for maybe somebody will call up now.
Sure.
Maybe some lesbian feminist labels from the West Coast in the 70s.
Yeah,
I'm sure
whatever the shags were.
I'm sure they had much more autonomy. But in the general industry as a whole, no. And even now, it's not like we're sitting here talking about a fait accompli. Like, I think it was GQ or some glossy magazine while I was writing the book did a list of the 100 best or 100 most successful DJs. And I think there was one woman, I think one black man. No disrespect to white males such as yourself and my lovely family members and other close friends, but you know what I mean? It's been a hegemony, hasn't it, of the patriarchy.
It's very surprising to hear that about there only being one black man. Like,
it was
hip-hop.
tragic.
Was it Africa Bambaataa?
I suppose that was the thinking and the aesthetic of that men's magazine. It was sort of a glossy men's magazine.
There was something happening politically that allowed that to happen among these women, but also there was just something that we talk about a lot when we talk about punk is, the DIY aspect of it. So there was access to all of those tools and to start something relatively organically.
That was a huge part of it, because you didn't have to wait for the green light from, some very big record company label guy. Again, it's not even against men. It's just the sort of person that was that cultural gatekeeper. I mean, look at Jeff Travis. He's a white male. You couldn't get any more white and male than him. Yet, he appreciated and he sought out women's creativity. Yes. So he, as a white male, had a huge influence in getting women's music out, from the Raincoats and Kleenex to many, many more. They did distribute my Laundrette single. So yeah, it's not the problem of white males to me, it's the problem of mindset. However it's packaged, and that the hegemony of a mindset, you see. But you see, what is it even, when they talk about revolutionaries, quote, in quote, revolutionaries, like, do you remember the famous Huey P. Newton quote? What is the role of a woman in the revolution? Prone. Yeah. Something like that. And the big fights I had, even with a great revolutionary, Peter Tosh, very often when it comes to hanging on to your male-controlled territory, guys can get very territorial. And not very, as another male revolutionary put it, not very one love, So it's the attitude. People like to hang on to what they've got, don't they? They don't want to give up power easily.
I wonder how much of it, too, is just this idea of, we need to fight this one fight at a time.
Maybe, but it's not the most effective way of bringing about change.
Yeah.
Because you need the women. And it's like that fight I had with Peter Tosh that I talk about in the book, who I obviously really admire and was very close to several women in his life. And he was just saying that men are more valuable, really, than women, he seemed to be saying, because he used this analogy. If we were down on the docks, I could pick up a big sack of rice and you couldn't. Well, what's that for an argument? If it's a woman, you might think of something that just picks up the rice and puts it somewhere without you having to strain like that. It's not the only way to measure strength and value. It's a very reductive way. And if people, those so-called revolutionaries, were thinking like that, it is an argument, Brian, but it's incorrect.
When you were making music that first time around, did it feel revolutionary?
Yes. I felt completely then that I had been freed by punk. I took it for granted I wouldn't really do music. I'm musical, and I've just completed my first album with the legendary Youth of Killing Joke. The whole idea of getting up and doing music was really beyond my... I had never thought of it.
The idea of standing on stage
and making music. And to be honest, even when I was in the Flying Lizards and doing the work with John Lydon and so on and Robert White, I still never thought of getting on stage, actually. It's a wee bit different for me, because even though I genuinely am musical, at the same time I was always called in various directions. It's not like I don't enjoy writing, or rather, let's say, it's not like I don't have the same love-hate with writing that all writers do. I feel like, writing is a lifelong commitment. For me, I expect, all being well, to write till I drop, But no, I just sort of hadn't thought of it. It was such a lonely path. You would have to be massively committed to forging ahead with music. And I remember when I stopped doing music as a professional thing, in getting into the mid-80s, and went into independent television. I definitely remember, there were various personal factors as well, like Eve, my musical partner, she had to attend to family matters due to ill health in France, so our duo split up. But I remember thinking, God, there's not much joy in this for a woman artist. Let me go and explore, in this industry. I was already over 30. I couldn't really see a place for myself when I had other things to do as well.
You're talking about an already very difficult industry to break into, a difficult thing to sustain,
fickle, very fickle.
But then these other issues on top of it.
And no role models at all. Nobody was really doing it, except for real folky, Aryan-looking folky people. Yeah. Not to diminish her. Joni Mitchell, she's the goal. Obviously she's brilliant anyway, but they wanted you to be like Joni Mitchell.
Joan Baez.
Joan Baez. They were sort of folky, soulful, folky. I just couldn't see a place for myself in the industry, knowing the industry quite well. Plus, I had other skills that I also enjoyed flexing, and I spent a happy 1980s doing independent television.
And I think music is like this as much, if not more, than other industries, in that it's very stuck in its ways as far as recreating hits. But also aesthetically, once the industry finds something that's a hit, it wants to reproduce it ad infinitum.
Yeah, but now, you see, what I was noticing while writing this book is... I'm not the only one. Loads of women. For a start, punk opened a door for that too. If you look at people like Vice Subversa and Poison Girls, she only started in her early 40s. And yet, because of that tabula rasa open door policy, that wasn't really a problem for her in punk. Punk created a space for her because you didn't have to be a teenage folky. Suddenly you could be another sort of voice. So that was really, really huge. So, and now what I found when doing the book is even people from the group Malaria in Germany, they have an exclamation point, so I always pronounce them like that. You know, they're coming back and doing new albums. You know, many, many people. Even Goldie from Goldie and the Gingerbreads, I only just heard she's done a new album. It definitely, I feel there has been a shift in the zeitgeist.
Yeah.
And that people are missing the female voices. And they're even missing the voices of their youth.
I went to one of the Bikini Kill shows
there you
in
go.
Brooklyn.
That's the great example, Bikini Kill.
And they sold out 5
2
nights. 5 nights in 2 seconds. So obviously something is happening. Were you seeing that as you were writing this
yes.
book? You were seeing the sort of
and
beginnings?
I mentioned it in the epilogue, yeah. And then after I'd done the book, in fact, just as I was finishing editing the book, Youth, the producer, asked if I'd be interested to do an album as a project, and I was like, whoa. It's because I had been asked to play in Berlin, and I added up all the time on my Resolutionary reissue, realised I didn't have enough material. Youth offered to do a couple of songs with me, so I'd have a couple of songs to fill an hour. And then it led to this album, which I think you'll enjoy. I'm not sure when it's coming out, but when I go to England now, we're going to master it. Yeah.
With the book specifically, because of everything that was happening both in broader context and then in your own life, especially with, it sounds like that album being re-release of your older stuff was a big part of this as well. Did you feel a sense of pressure in writing this book that you wouldn't have had otherwise, in that there was so much more focus on you and your stuff that this was going to be a pretty important book for you in your career?
Well, honestly, it's not that easy to write a book, is it?
I can't imagine it is.
It's torture. You have to really want to do it. It's terrible pressure. Whether I'd had it's a lot of pressure. I don't even know. I mean, I was glad that the CD or album led to me being asked to do this book, but I don't see how one could have felt more pressure than one felt. I don't think having the music out added to the pressure.
Yeah.
It's top pressure anyway.
Sure.
Exodus was huge pressure. Each of them took me like 2.5 years, one way or the other. Even though this is smaller than my book of Exodus, it was a lot of research, a lot of finding the people.
Was there something that happened in the writing of the book? Was there something that sort of clicked where you knew that you knew you were on the right track and you knew you were doing the right thing?
Yes, definitely. As it went on, and I was assembling, in a sense, my thesis, as it were, what I felt was true, and backing it up, and then having all these fascinating talks to all these women artists. And what I was hoping was to find a Babel of voices, really, sort of all sorts of intentions and aesthetics and points of view, in a very rich mix of female creativity. And that is what I found. I mean, even Jia Wang, the Chinese artist from Hang in the Box, we think women punks are controversial, but she's even more controversial because she's anti-abortion. I was so amazed because I realized I had become, sort of placid. I expected that everybody, but it's true that punk is mainly a sort of liberal and progressive movement. So I was shocked. So I found shocking things while doing the book. And then, I came back to Fertile Miseria because, as I was starting to say, the activist aspect of punk had always engaged me beyond, the nice sound, as it were, or ugly nice sound. And they're so exemplary. They're really on the front line of Columbia, and they have no inhibitions. They totally understand what Fell used to describe using music as a weapon. I might even read you a little bit of what they say, chuck a bit of what is it? We talked through email, and then in the end, with the help of Xenia, the Russian journalist, I really sort of got to talk to them more directly. A lot still via email, but anyway, this is what they wrote when I asked them to be in the book. And they actually went and had a meeting about whether to do it. And so then they wrote me as a collective.
Why the hesitation on their part?
Because they're political, and that's how you always have to go and function as a group, don't you? If you remember, you cast your mind back.
Sure. It was less about your moves and more just making sure everybody was on board with
it. And speak collectively. Yeah. So they say Fertile Miseria, meaning fertile misery, has been around since 1990, screaming with pain, anger, at the injustice that's seen in our country. In addition to the drug war we had to live through with Pablo Escobar, this increased scourge of guerrilla and paramilitary factions caused the group of displaced people in our country to grow every day. At their gigs, they collect food and clothes and things to give to people in need. So I was touched by the way they understood, you know, not their own indigenous, beautiful, beautiful musics, of which Colombia has so much, like the cumbia and the vallenato. When it came to speaking directly to the crisis situation in which they were continually finding themselves, they turned to punk. Mm. And it's two sisters at the heart of it, the Castro sisters, Piedad and Vicky. One of their bass player, Juan Carlos Londoño, he was actually briefly a disappeared person. He was sort of kidnapped. Punk was their chosen medium of expression, and they've been doing it all this time since 1990, and they're combining the activism with the culture. And, you know, literally they're, as it were, keeping the faith. I did just love them, and their song Visiones de la Muerte, Visions of Death, which has a video that you can see on YouTube. Very affecting, very affecting. Yeah, so totally, when I was able to have that dialogue with them, I found them through their music. I was so touched. I mean, I was riveted. It was everything that I sort of had felt was happening. They did embody it. And then when I talked to them more beyond the collective, I realized, yeah, they're actually sisters. So like I say in the book, sisterhood really saves. And even if they're not genetic, you can find, you know, I'm lucky to have a couple in my life. I'm very lucky. I have my actual sisters, numbering 2. And then I've got another couple of posse girlfriends who stick by me. And you do need that.
They're the ones in this conversation specifically that you've come back to the most. And obviously they were going to play an important role in the book to be the kind of the end of it, to be the conclusion of the thesis. What is it about them? Why was it clear that they were the place where the book needed to close?
Well, just as I said, they were on the front line, and they were doing it all the way. And they chose punk as their music of choice. They had a number of musics they could have done of local musics. But no, they liked people like Wendy O. Williams and the Plasmatics. Okay.
So performance artists in a sense, at least she was, certainly.
Yeah.
Do you feel like they embody a way forward in a way?
They embody, to me, a rigorous truth and an integrity of combining culture, making music, and making change.
I guess I ask from the standpoint of, you know, the idea of this almost being a handbook for somebody starting out, that you want the end of the book to be this kind of, this last bit that sort of pushes people off into the world, that gives them the momentum if they're sort of starting their bands and trying to figure out how to do it.
I hope it gives them the encouragement and don't be afraid, seize it, live it, do it. Because music is not as central, arguably, as it was when I started out, when it was the main medium that held youth together. But I think music still has a particular potency, and I did want the book to be an encouragement. Sort of encouragement I didn't really have until punk gave me a crew of other women.
How much of a role has this book, and researching this book, talking to all the women that you spoke to for this book, how much of a role has it played in your continued music making?
Good question. Yet another good question. I mean, it's just building on that foundation that I got from the time. Had I not come, even though, you know, when I was in the Flying Lizards, it was me and all guys, but the encouragement that I had to do it was also from having sung a lot with people like Nena and Ari from the Slits before, when I was doing reggae backup singing, and just knowing, I mean, again, had it been my sole skill, maybe I would have stuck with it differently.
Yeah.
As it hadn't really crossed my mind to do it, you see, until the other girls came along. I'd done it at home, and even when I stopped doing music then, right, as it were, stopped in quotes, I always said to myself, you know, nothing can stop you actually being a musician. Because I was like, oh, you know, but nothing can stop you being a musician. I can always sing and just sing with my friends. Nothing can stop me doing music.
I think there's a lesson here, too, that, you know, if somebody can do it, if somebody can make music and have a fatwa out on their life, then something as relatively trivial as age shouldn't get in your way. You know, all these reasons you've been putting it off, all these excuses you've been making don't amount to a lot when you look at people who, like, literally are putting their lives on the line to make music.
Yes. I don't at all think Pragash were wrong to stop when they had that fatwa on them, because it was extremely real. But it shows the significance of young women making music.
There you go. That was Vivien Goldman. Her latest, Revenge of the She-Punks, A Feminist History from Poly Styrene to Pussy Riot, is out now on University of Texas Press. Thanks so much to her for taking the time to do that. Always a pleasure catching up. Thanks to you guys, as always, for listening to the program. If you like the show, there are a number of ways to support us. You can rate and review us on iTunes, Google Podcasts. We're on Spotify and YouTube now. Like us on Facebook. If you have any feedback, it's rolcast@gmail.com. Follow us on Tumblr. That's rolcast.tumblr.com. That's the first and best place to get all of your RIYL related information. And that's about all we got for now, so stick around, because we're going to be back just about this time next week with another episode of RIYL.